So our topic for today, and I sort of get into the whole fantasy genre, and I really like that stuff, sort of action and fantasy, and I love The Hobbit. So it's pretty timely. I'm sitting there watching the Desolation of Smaug, not Smog, not Smog, but Smaug. You have to pronounce it correctly. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, this is like, is this guy Tolkien like a Tolkien Jew? Because it seems to me to be so connected with Jewish identity, Jewish history, and the story of the Jewish people. And it sort of grabbed me. And so I asked myself, maybe we should develop some sort of... Would you like some pizza? Please. No, really. We bought it for you, so you can have it. So,
Pizza, run past the plates. No.
Pass the plates. No. Pass the pizza.
Thanks.
Enjoy. So here I am, Rabbi, one of the rabbis of the Aish Center, and want to discuss with you a movie and its sort of Jewish undertones. But there happens to be some precedent, even in the Talmud, for using movies as
Hi, how are you?
For using movies as a means to study Torah. I'm going to quote this for you. It's in the Tractate of Megillah. It says, Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina said, what's the meaning of the following text? This is a verse in Zechariah. It's in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 7. And it says, I will take away his blood out of his mouth and his detestable things from between his teeth, and he also shall be a remnant for our God. Pretty gruesome sort of visuals there. But in the end, the Talmud says, what does it mean to say, and he shall, and the verse goes on, and he shall be as a chief in Judah and Ekron as a Jebusite. So the Talmud refers or extrapolates somehow to say, these are the theaters in which one day the kings of Judah shall publicly teach the Torah. So we learn from Zechariah, as extrapolated through the Talmud, that you're even allowed to use theater to understand Torah concepts. And so that's what we're going to do today, understand a little bit of some Torah concepts within the context of modern contemporary movies. So let me just spell out the theme of this movie to you all, okay? We have in short a quest of short, chubby, bearded people, okay? Short, chubby, bearded people who in the eyes of the rest of the world always look very, very tiny. Not to themselves, of course, but to the rest of the world, they seem very tiny, insignificant things, who are on a quest to reclaim their mountain city, their national homeland that's on top of a mountain, and to retrieve, you ever hear the song, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav? What does that mean? The Jerusalem of gold? Here you have these short, chubby, bearded guys on a quest to reclaim their mountain city of gold. Pursued by countless numbers of orcs. These guys. There is no end to the orc population. They just stream out of everywhere. There's no end. No matter how many of them they kill, there are more and more and more orcs. They come from everywhere. And who would have guessed that there was no limit to the number of people who would want to stop this tiny race from reclaiming its national homeland? Am I painting a little bit of a familiar picture here? And furthermore, they bump into the elves. The elves, those highfalutin snotty-nosed, high society people who really look at the dwarves as sort of smelly money grubbers, but who join in the fight against the enemy because of the philosophy of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Are there some similarities that you see going on even in contemporary society? The elves who believe that they superseded the dwarves as far as the most important race or people, who despise the dwarves because they're dirty and money grubbing, but yet support them in their plight to reclaim their national homeland because of a common enemy. Just saying. Just saying. Sounds very strange and also strangely familiar. And if you look, and you can find this on YouTube, by the way, you can find an interview with Tolkien. It's called Tolkien Interview, 1971. You can listen to it on YouTube, and at minute number 7, he says, and I'm going to quote it exactly as he said it, "The dwarves are quite obviously, wouldn't you say that in many ways they remind you of the Jews?" That's what Tolkien himself said in 1971 when he was being interviewed about the different races and classes of people that he created in his books and his novels. Very interesting. So the question really is, and again, I'm not a movie critic, even though I enjoyed it and I thought that the action was good and I thought that Smaug was really great and the portrayal by Benedict Cumberbatch. I have no idea why this man has become so famous, but
Sherlock.
Pardon?
Sherlock.
Right, he's Sherlock. He was Khan in the Star Trek movie. Man, the guy's everywhere. I don't know why he's so famous now, but he did a good job as Smaug. That's why I enjoyed the movie, and I'm not here to really talk about the movie in a critical way, but I would like us to understand the theme of the movie, especially since we know that there are some undertones of the dwarves being likened to the Jewish people. And really the question is, what is it that drives these dwarves? What is pushing them? What's the secret to their determination? They can't even get their, if you've ever seen the movie or read the books, they can't get their own people to be behind them. Everybody else, all the other dwarves, and they're scattered all across the diaspora, there's a small group that say, you know what, we belong back in our homeland, and they can't convince the rest of the dwarves of the diaspora that this is important. So here they have this tiny group. How could they possibly win? How could they even imagine that they would win? And why would they try? That's the question that I'd like us to ask today. Where are those little packets that I passed out? Because even though I passed them out, I also need one.
Yes.
Oh, sure.
So if there are any, I only made a couple of copies, but here's another copy for you all. So let's try to use Jewish history as a guide to understand what was the determinism of the determination behind what these dwarves were doing. Now, over the past 2,000 plus years or so, Jews have had ample opportunity to fight for and stand up for Jewish beliefs. Right? Would you guess that we've had ample opportunity to stand up for what we believe in? You can even meet some of those people. You go to Israel, you can meet a man named Natan Sharansky. He was a prisoner of conscience, a man who endured years and years of psychological and physical torture just for the ability to be Jewish. He's alive today. You can meet him. Jewish history is replete with Sharansky's. People, Jews, willing to give up their lives for what Jews believe. The question is, because our Western ears, when we hear this concept of sacrificing for a belief, it sort of rubs us the wrong way. We get visions of maybe even suicide bombers, of sacrificing our lives for what we believe in. Sounds very drastic to our Western ears. So I'd like to talk to you today about if there is any logic behind that kind of philosophy. There's any reason behind why, in our own history, Jews were willing to give up their lives for Judaism. Why would they do such a thing, is really the question. So, one of Judaism's most inspiring legends is of Rabbi Akiva. Everybody know who Rabbi Akiva was? If you ever go to Israel and you go to Tiberias, Tiberia, you can go to his grave. He's a real guy. It was a real grave. He was one of the greatest Talmudic sages of his time and really one of the greatest scholars of all time, who was an ignoramus. Until he was 40 years old, he was illiterate. He was a farmhand. He was an illiterate. He didn't know Aleph and Bet. Didn't know the difference. Couldn't read. And at 40 years old, decided, because of a moment of inspiration, that he was going to change himself and be different. And he became, from a total ignoramus, to one of the greatest sages of our history. Well, he lived around the 1st century of the Common Era. And that was the time of the Roman takeover of Jerusalem and of Israel. And the Romans had some pretty strict laws. In fact, their laws were specifically focused on obliterating Judaism. You couldn't practice Judaism publicly, and you definitely couldn't teach or learn Jewish topics publicly. In defiance, Rabbi Akiva assembled his students, and he taught them. And he was dragged away, he was arrested, dragged away in chains, and tortured to death in the public square. You know the story? Have you heard this story before? Tortured to death in the public square. And with his last few breaths of life, he said, Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And all of his students were around him. And you know what they said? They said, seriously? They're like, really, Rebbe? Are you kidding? And Rabbi Akiva replied that he had been waiting his entire life. He had been striving his entire life to reach a moment of dedication to what Judaism believes and stands for. That he'd be willing to give up his life for those ideals. And now that he has the opportunity to do it, he said to his students, I'm going to do it with joy. And when he said, V'ahavta, and you will love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. According to the legend in the Talmud, that's when he died. And he said that he would love the Lord his God with all of his soul. So, was Rabbi Akiva superhuman?
No.
No. And yet he was explaining to his students and everyone who had assembled in the square to watch his tortured death that this was a moment of great joy for him. Really? Was it really so pleasurable having the hot iron combs rake the flesh off of his body, which is what the Talmud described as how he died? Would we, Would we want to be put in such a joyous situation? Is that what we're hoping for, looking forward to as far as expressing ourselves in our Judaism? What was the joy? In that very Shema Yisrael, which is, of course, we know is Judaism's pledge of allegiance, it says, B'chol nafshecha, with all your soul. That Jews everywhere are entreated every day, 2-3 times a day, to express in the Shema Yisrael that we should be willing to die for this stuff. That's what the words say. You should be willing to die for this stuff. What? Is that what Judaism really believes? Do we believe that we should go around martyring ourselves, dying for this stuff? Is that the pleasure we're looking for out of our Judaism? Sounds pretty foreign, and yet it says it in the most fundamental affirmation of Jewish belief. So is it pleasurable? It is. But what's the pleasure? It's the pleasure of clarity, the pleasure of commitment. Judaism teaches something very, very different about what it means to have pleasure in life. And let me explain. If you can get to a point where you can perceive something that's so important, define something for yourself that is so intrinsic to your very existence that you'd be willing to sacrifice it all for that thing, but then, and you come to those conclusions, that's when Judaism teaches your life has weight. Your life has purpose. What the Shema Yisrael teaches us is the following that my Rebbe, Rabbi Weinberg of blessed memory, taught me. Until you know what you're willing to die for, you have not yet begun to live. Material pleasures are nice and they're also necessary, but there's no doubt in our minds that they don't compare to the pleasure of love. They don't compare to the pleasure of having meaning in your life. And when you found something so meaningful that you would die for it, and then you turn around and you actually devote your life to it, devoting your life to something that you'd be willing to die for actually is one of the most powerful and pleasurable experiences of living. It also happens to be the secret to Jewish heroism. Let's look at this first quote I have here. Somebody like to read that quote? This is from the introduction to a book called The Jewish State, The Search for the Soul of Israel. And it was written by a man, his name is Yarom Chazoni, and he is describing in this section that I've highlighted for you here, he's describing what his experience was while he was on reserve duty in the IDF. Someone who wants to read for me? I'll do it. Want to follow along? Do you see where I've underlined it? The Jews of Israel are an exhausted people, confused and without direction. This is not to say that they are unwilling to fight. Israelis still agree that they will carry on their struggle if they must. But in no end of discussions, it was made clear to me that there was a vast gulf between their willingness to fight and sacrifice and their ability to understand why they should do so. Certainly, they all knew that we are at war, including those who believed we could and should get out of it. But as soon as the discussion skidded close to the reasons that it might be worth being in this fight, the screen went blank. Of what value is the Jewish people? What can it contribute to mankind? What is to be gained by joining its struggle? Why should one sacrifice on its behalf? Why should the Jewish state exist at all? Sorry, that got cut off. These are questions that do not expect to hear answered at too high a level by every soldier in the IDF. But on the other hand, without some answer as to what this was all about, this people, its country, its seemingly endless war, no army can possibly keep fighting for very long. You have to know, if you want to fight the good fight, what it's all about. You have to know the reasons why. You have to know what it's for. You have to know the meaning behind it. It's not just a fight to fight. There's a purpose. There's a purpose to, in this context, a purpose to, in Israel, the existence of a Jewish state inhabited by a Jewish people. Whatever, I don't want to get political here, but you understand the context. A person has to know the reason. Going through life, the motions of life, without purpose, the fight gets tedious. And who wants to continue on with that? So the secret of Jewish heroism is this, and it is why there have been so many Jews who have been willing to die, to sacrifice themselves for what Jews believe in. Why? Because Judaism teaches that it is better, it is more pleasurable to die for a purpose, for meaning, than to live without meaning or purpose. Yeah.
To what extent can this be taken to day-to-day life and replace the word death with sacrifice for others? And say, at what point have you begun to live when you realize what you would sacrifice for others?
That's exactly the point, Zach. It really is exactly the point. It's not about I don't want to die. Do you want to die?
No,
I don't want to die either. It reminds me of that old joke. A Catholic priest, a Protestant minister, and a rabbi were all being asked, you know, if you were to have an open casket funeral, what would you want people to say about you? The Catholic priest says, I'd want them to say that I was generous and kind. And the Protestant minister says, I'd want them to say that I was sweet and very doting on my parishioners. And the rabbi said, I'd want them to say, oh, look, he's moving. Right? We don't want to die. We don't want to die. Who wants to die? Not me. Not me. The question is really, it's not about dying. It's really understanding the flip side and living for what you'd be willing to die for. That really is the message that I want us to come away with today, because that's the secret of the dwarves of Erebor, which happens to also be the secret of Jewish survival. Be willing to live for what you're willing to die for. And there's no end to the role models that you can attach yourselves to. Hi there. Well.
There's a lot of pizza left.
Pentagon wouldn't let us in.
I'm so sorry to hear that. Welcome nonetheless. We're almost done, but welcome.
No, please sit.
Come on, have a seat.
That's a lot of pizza.
There was a lot of security here.
So right, so again, the message. So the message is: be willing to live for what you're willing to die for. But Judaism teaches you have to define the second first. Meaning, a person has to define for themselves what is so important, so intrinsic to their very existence and the continued existence of humanity that you feel as though you couldn't live without. There are people who say they would die for a pair of shoes or a Coach bag. That's not what we're talking about. And like I said, there's no end to the number of role models in Jewish history that you can attach yourselves to be inspired. Whether it's looking into the history of Rabbi Akiva, or looking into and speaking with Natan Sharansky, or reading the book of Eli Cohen, our man in Damascus, any number of Jews through our thousands and thousands of years of history, role models of people who understood. Yes, this is what I'm willing to die for, and so let me live for this goal. Because living for that is power and pleasure. One of the most important Jewish values that my rabbi taught me was that Judaism is not about comfort. Comfort is good. It's nice. But comfort always equals lack of meaning. There's really only so long you can sit on a beach and tan. There's just so long you can do that before you come to the conclusion that, what am I living for? For this? Should I just let the whole world go by? And so Judaism insists that we ask ourselves the toughest questions. Not just once, not just on January 1st as our New Year's resolutions, and not even only on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but every day. Every day we are entreated by our sages to ask the tough question. Today, what am I living for? What am I living for? Today, what is my life all about? So you might ask me, a rabbi, there are so many people out there who are willing to die for their causes. That all sort of political entities out there who are willing to literally give up their lives for their causes, for their beliefs. What makes the ideal in Judaism so different? Are we like the suicide bombers, willing to give up our lives in that way for our message? No, obviously. So what's the difference? The difference is the message.
We're trying to help people.
But it's even bigger than that, Zach. You know, in order to understand that you be willing, as the Shema Yisrael says, willing, every day it says, with all your soul, you have to be willing to die for this stuff. How on earth can any of us be willing to die for anything if we don't understand what it means? If we don't understand what it stands for? It's part of the reason why every Jewish person has to be a learned person. Why education is the ultimate mitzvah. That there's nothing greater that you should occupy your time with than learning stuff. There's no greater mitzvah. Because you can't possibly be committed to something you don't know what it says. So what do we stand for? What should we be willing to die for? Oh, love your neighbor as you love yourself? Yes. Equality before the law? Absolutely. The sanctity of human life in every circumstance? That's what Judaism stands for. Just to name a few. That's what we should be willing to put our lives on the line for, to maintain the status quo of the sanctity and dignity of human beings, of human life everywhere, and of love between every human being. We should be willing to put our lives on the line for those ideals. That's what Judaism teaches. It's the secret of Jewish longevity. The reason why we're still here. Because we're willing to fight for those ideals. But we're losing some ground. If you look on the next page of what I've written here, not what I've written, what I've highlighted. This was a study that was commissioned by the Avichai Foundation in Israel, and you know what? I'm sorry that I didn't write down. I forget what the title is called. If you want to know exactly, it's like a long document that highlights the differences in philosophy and how Jews define themselves religiously or not religiously. You have to share. I only made a few copies, so please share. Anyhow, so how Jews in Israel view themselves politically, religiously, through the definition of religion. So if you look at the highlighted part here, I highlighted too much. 1, 2, 3, 4 lines down. There is a perceptible difference, however, in the attitudes of the religious, the traditional, and the non-religious toward individual freedoms on the one hand and social and civic altruism on the other. Religious and traditional respondents are committed, for the most part, to the collective, and not just in the national and religious context, whereas the prime commitment of non-religious and anti-religious respondents is to personal freedom. You see, this is the issue. If you're not learned, and you don't understand what you're fighting for and what it all means, and the heaviness of it all, then by and large, what you're fighting for is only yourself. And living only for your personal freedom doesn't really lend itself to great sacrifice, because it's really defining your life through your own personal comfort. Whereas the traditionalists who have learned something about the why are more apt to vote that they are committed to the collective, the larger humanity, because that's what Judaism teaches, and that's what Judaism has always decided that it's worth giving your life for. Not in my way, I'll just end with a quote from Shakespeare. Yeah, I know, I'm finishing. Shakespeare said, "A coward dies many a death. A brave man dies but once." You know, my father always told me, there's only two things you got to do in this world: die and pay taxes. We're all going to die. I know that for a fact. I'm 99.9% sure that we're all going to die. The question is, when you die, how will you be defined at that moment? And now I'll just take questions if anybody has any. Yeah.
What do you think about like the sacrifice of Samson compared to Akiva?
You mean how he ended up?
Because he also kind of, I mean, he was forced in the situation in a way, but then he called out to God to ask him to kind of redeem him, and
Right. It's a little bit different story because he in doing what he did, he ended his own life because he concluded that through his own death, many would be saved. Judaism teaches that it's a mitzvah to do that, but it's not an obligation to do that. So it's a little bit of it's a different context, and sort of the legalities of it are different. Mainly because Rabbi Akiva was dying simply because he was Jewish and wanted to stand up for Jewish education and what Jews believe. And Samson, Shimshon, was sort of a figurehead. He was a leader who became, I guess, he got corrupted in a certain way, and in the end of his life decided that his method of tshuva, his method of repentance, would be to give up his life in order to save his community from the hands of the Philistines. So you're right that presumably the motivation was the same, right? That his sacrifice was for the greater cause and the eventual being saved from the Philistine people who were not being so nice to us. But yeah, so Judaism teaches that that in truth there is no growth unless there is some sacrifice. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to give up your life, and we don't want you to, at least not literally, but figuratively maybe. In order to be better, in order to grow in any way, you have to be willing to sacrifice. There's really no other way. It's the human condition. There's no other way. You have to get off of your comfort. Comfort is not living. Yeah.
What's your opinion on words of encouragement, either from yourself or through the Torah, to a person who is fighting for their life physically to live? Someone who's basically terminally ill, is dying. Let's say they have cancer, but they're living.
Well, I mean, that's a tough thing to answer. Obviously, not because I think all situations like that are very specific, right? But
in a
general way,
living for a reason versus if you have no reason to live, you may as well be dead.
Right.
So what is?
You're right, and that's really the important aspect right there. Is coming to the conclusion that there's no reason to live is foreign to Judaism, right? Judaism teaches, and again, I don't want to get into this end-of-life discussion. It's way too long, and we're leaving. But Judaism believes, generalizing, that we have to prolong a person's life really at any cost. Because every moment that a person is alive is another opportunity to make a difference. And we never shirk that opportunity. And we never give up. As the Talmud says, even if there is a knife, right? The sword is at your throat. You don't stop praying. You never know. You never know. Thankfully, I was just in Israel a week ago. And, we were touring Masada. And, of course, the question came up, how do we view Masada in Judaism? We understand it's been sort of marketed as a site of heroism, Jewish heroism. But is that what traditional Judaism would teach? And we really can't judge because we weren't in that spot, and it's too difficult to judge anybody who's being pressured to become enslaved to a power that is brutal. But we can't really judge their decision to kill themselves. But in theory, traditional Judaism would be forced to say, you should live to fight another day. And who knows how long the Roman Empire would continue. Maybe they'd be disrupted the day after you put into life. The question is, we don't know what the future brings, and we have no right to play God with people's lives. And so the words of encouragement are really, there's no such thing as no more reason to live. Because every wink, every smile is another opportunity to make a difference to somebody. And with that, we have a hard stop here at 2, so it's now 5 minutes to 2, and I'm going to thank you all for coming.